Danielle stood at the far end of the training ground, sweat dripping down her forehead, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The sun above burned hot, but it was not the heat that made her knees shake. It was the weight of another failure. The whistle had blown, the drill was over, and she was once again at the back of the line, out of breath, behind the rest, and far from the standard. The other recruits were already gathering near the benches, wiping their faces, exchanging quick jokes, or nodding at one another in silent encouragement. Danielle remained a few steps behind, clutching her knees and trying not to let the frustration show on her face. She hated this feeling. She hated finishing last. Most of all, she hated the thought that everyone around her believed she did not belong here. The program was not an ordinary camp. It was one of the toughest military combat training courses in the country, designed to push every recruit to the edge of physical and mental exhaustion. Only the strongest were expected to last. Danielle had known this from the start, yet she had still signed her name, still walked into this world that so many had told her was not meant for someone like her. Her friends had been supportive, but she could still remember the doubtful looks from a few neighbors back home. "She's strong, but this is different. This is for the toughest of the tough," she had overheard one of them whisper. Danielle had brushed it off at the time, telling herself she would prove them wrong. Now, with each drill she failed, those words echoed louder inside her mind. The instructor shouted again, calling the recruits to form ranks. Danielle straightened herself and jogged forward, her muscles screaming in protest. She stood tall, back straight, trying to mask her exhaustion. The group stood like statues, sweat glistening on their foreheads as the lead instructor barked out their next challenge. "Obstacle course! Move!" The group sprinted toward the course. Ropes, walls, mud pits, balance beams, everything was designed to break them down. Danielle's heart sank. This was the one that always left her behind. She swallowed hard, ignoring the doubt rising in her chest. The first few obstacles went as expected. She pulled herself over the first wall, but struggled to get her leg over the second. Her arms burned with the effort. A male recruit behind her muttered under his breath, impatient for her to move faster. Danielle bit her lip and forced herself over, landing clumsily on the other side. She kept running, mud splashing beneath her boots. By the halfway point, she was already behind. Her breath was uneven, her arms heavy, her legs trembling. She watched others leap across the rope swings, with ease while she slipped and barely managed to hold on. Each mistake made her more frustrated. When she finally reached the crawling section under barbed wire, she felt the full weight of defeat pressing down. Her body moved slower and slower until she lay flat in the dirt, unable to lift herself up. Again. She could hear the trainers shouting, the sound of boots pounding past her, but her own world grew quiet. All she could hear was her own breath, ragged and desperate. Finally, an instructor's whistle blew sharply. The drill was over. Danielle had not finished. Again, she pushed herself up and stood aside, her body aching, mud smeared across her uniform. Her eyes stung, though she refused to let tears fall in front of the others. The recruits gathered near the end of the course. Some congratulated each other, others laughed off their mistakes. Danielle stood at the edge of the group, silent, the failure heavy on her shoulders. Later that evening in the barracks, Danielle sat on her bunk staring at the floor. The room was filled with the low hum of voices, the creak of beds, and the clinking of water bottles. She could hear laughter from the far side, where a group of trainees swapped stories from the day. No one looked at her. No one said anything. She was invisible, yet painfully obvious at the same time. She leaned back, her mind filled with the memory of her mother's words before she had left home. "You are strong, Danielle. You've always been strong. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do this." But what if her mother had been wrong? What if this dream was too big for her? She pressed her hands together, closing her eyes for a moment. She wanted to believe she could still rise above this, but belief felt harder to hold on to with every passing day. The next morning came too quickly. The whistle blew again before dawn, pulling everyone from their beds. Danielle dressed in silence, her movements slow, her body sore. She walked out with the others, the cool air stinging her skin. Another day, another drill, another chance to prove herself, or another chance to fall. She tightened her fists, whispering softly to herself, "Don't quit. Just one more try." But deep down, a question lingered. How many times could she fall before there was no strength left to rise? And though she didn't know it yet, someone had been watching her. Someone who saw more than her failures. Someone who, with a single order, would change everything. The next morning, Danielle marched with the other recruits toward the training field. The sky was still painted with soft gray clouds, and the air was cool, but inside her chest, the heat of anxiety burned stronger than ever. Every step felt heavier than the last. She could almost hear the whispers of doubt following her, those of her fellow recruits, those of her neighbors back home, and worst of all, the whispers inside her own head. The group formed a straight line. Their boots hit the ground with force as they came to a stop. The instructors barked commands, and everyone responded with a loud, "Yes, sir!" Danielle's voice joined theirs, strong and steady on the outside, but trembling within. The first drill of the day began with a long run across uneven ground. The recruits sprinted forward, the sound of boots pounding in unison filling the morning air. Danielle started strong, her arms pumping, her breath controlled. For a few moments, she allowed herself to believe she could keep up this time, but soon the others pulled ahead. Their strides were longer, their pace smoother. Danielle's legs began to feel heavy, her lungs burning. She forced herself to push harder, but the gap widened with every second. A voice inside her whispered, "Not again. Not today." By the halfway point, she was near the back. Sweat rolled down her face, and her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She kept moving, but the frustration grew sharper. Every failure felt like a scar she couldn't erase. When the run ended, Danielle collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving. She pressed her palms into the dirt, ashamed of how quickly her strength had given out. Around her, the other recruits stretched, some even joking with each other about how easy the warm-up had been. She lowered her head, pretending to tie her, laces just to hide her face. But hiding didn't change the truth. She was failing again. Later that day, during a short break, Danielle sat alone on the edge of the field, sipping water. She could hear two recruits talking nearby, their voices hushed but not quiet enough. "She's not going to last long," one said. "She's too slow. Every drill, she's the one holding us back," the other replied. Danielle's hands tightened around her water bottle. Their words stung more than the ache in her muscles. She didn't turn to face them, didn't defend herself. Instead, she stared at the horizon, her jaw clenched, pretending she hadn't heard. But inside, she couldn't stop hearing it. That night, she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The barracks were dark except for the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the small windows. Around her, the other recruits breathed deeply, lost in dreams of tomorrow's victories. Danielle, however, lay wide awake with tomorrow's fears. Her thoughts drifted to her family. She pictured her younger brother sitting on the porch back home, telling his friends proudly, "My sister is training with the best of the best." She imagined her mother smiling, her eyes shining with pride as she waved goodbye on the day Danielle left. That memory made Danielle's chest ache. She could not bear the thought of calling home one day and saying, "I failed. I didn't make it," she whispered into the quiet room, as if speaking to herself. "I can't let them down." The following morning, the recruits gathered again for combat drills. Danielle's body was still sore from yesterday, but she refused to show weakness. She stood tall, her fists clenched, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The drill began with push-ups, sit-ups, and burpees, followed by another obstacle course. Danielle's arms shook. Her breaths came out in ragged bursts, but she kept moving. The mud clung to her uniform. The ropes burned her palms, and still she pushed forward. For a brief moment, as she hauled herself over one of the walls, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time she could finish. Maybe this time she could prove everyone wrong. But halfway through the course, her strength gave way. Her grip slipped on the rope, and she fell into the mud with a harsh thud. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and she lay there gasping, while the others charged. Ahead, the whistle blew, and the drill ended. Danielle dragged herself up, covered in mud, her face pale with exhaustion. She tried to hide the tremble in her hands as she stood with the others. But she didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her like the weight of the sky. That afternoon, the instructors gave the group a lecture about discipline, strength, and mental toughness. Danielle listened, but her mind was elsewhere. She wondered how many more failures it would take before they sent her home. When the lecture ended, she stayed behind for a few moments, staring at the empty training ground. The field stretched, wide and silent, the obstacles casting long shadows in the setting sun. To Danielle, they looked less like training tools and more like walls between her and the life she dreamed of. She clenched her fists. "I can't give up," she whispered. The words were soft, but they were all she had left to hold on to. What Danielle didn't realize was that she wasn't as invisible as she thought. Commander Harris, the seasoned SEAL, had been watching her for days. He had seen her stumble, fail, and collapse. But he had also seen something else, a stubborn fire in her eyes, a will that refused to die even when her body gave up. He knew she was different. She didn't need pity, and she didn't need special treatment. What she needed was the right push, the right order at the right time, and soon he planned to give it. The morning sun had barely risen when the recruits lined up again. The whistle blew sharp and loud, cutting through the cool air. Danielle stood in her place, her body already aching before the drills even began. She had barely slept, her mind filled with restless thoughts and worries. Yet, as always, she forced herself to stand tall, hoping no one could see the cracks forming inside her. The instructors wasted no time. "Combat drill, full course, no excuses." The recruits moved as one, charging forward. Danielle followed, her boots pounding the dirt. At first, she kept pace. She leapt over the first barrier, crawled under the wire, and scrambled through the mud pit. For a fleeting moment, she thought maybe today would be different. But then came the rope climb. Danielle jumped, grabbed the rope, and pulled. Her arms burned instantly. She gritted her teeth, pulling higher, higher, but halfway up, her grip slipped. She crashed back down, mud splashing across her face and uniform. The recruits around her didn't stop. They kept moving, their eyes fixed on finishing. Danielle tried again. She gripped the rope, her muscles screaming, her breath ragged. She made it up a little farther before her arms gave out once more. She fell again, this time hitting the ground harder. The world spun for a second. She lay there staring at the sky, the sounds of shouting and boots running past her. Her chest heaved, her body shaking, but what hurt most wasn't the fall. It was the realization that she was failing again. "Get up, recruit," an instructor barked. His voice was sharp but not cruel. Still, it cut into her like a blade. Danielle pushed herself to her knees, then to her feet. Her legs wobbled, her arms trembled, but she staggered forward, forcing herself to keep going. She crawled through the mud, stumbled over the beams, and dragged herself to the finish line, long after everyone else had already completed the course. When the whistle finally blew, Danielle collapsed to the ground. Her breaths came in short, broken gasps. She pressed her palms into the dirt, fighting back the tears that burned her eyes. Around her, the other recruits stood tall, wiping sweat, some smiling with relief. She remained on her knees, her body heavy, her spirit heavier. Later in the mess hall, Danielle sat alone at a corner table. Her food tray lay untouched in front of her. She stared down at it, her appetite gone. Across the room, she could hear the chatter of the others. Some were laughing, sharing stories about their drills, about the funny mistakes someone made, about the victories they felt proud of. Not a single word was spoken about her. Yet she felt their silence louder than any insult. Her chest tightened. She thought of her brother again, telling his friends proudly about her. She thought of her mother, smiling with hope. She thought of her neighbors who had doubted her, and she wondered if maybe they had been right all along. The pain of those thoughts cut deeper than the ache in her muscles. That night, when the lights went out in the barracks, Danielle lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling. Her hands rested on her stomach, her chest rising and falling slowly. She didn't cry. She was past tears now. Instead, she felt empty, like a shadow of herself. Maybe this isn't for me, she thought. Maybe I'm not meant to be here. She closed, her eyes trying to block out the thought, but it pressed harder, heavier, until it was all she could hear. The next morning, another drill began. Danielle's body felt heavier than ever, her steps slower. She tried, but every movement felt wrong, every effort too weak. Halfway through the run, her legs gave out, and she stumbled to the ground. This time, she didn't get up right away. She stayed there, face pressed against the dirt, her body refusing to move. Around her, the sound of recruits running past filled the air, but she felt distant, as if she wasn't even part of them anymore. "Recruit, move!" an instructor shouted. Danielle didn't answer. She pushed weakly at the ground, but her arms shook and collapsed beneath her. She lay flat, her breath ragged, the taste of defeat bitter in her mouth. A few recruits glanced back, their eyes filled with pity or annoyance. None stopped. Finally, 2 instructors rushed over. One knelt beside her. "Can you continue?" he asked. Danielle tried to nod, but her head barely moved. Her chest rose and fell like she had been carrying the weight of the world. For the first time since arriving, she felt the truth press against her heart. She couldn't go on like this. When the whistle blew to end the drill, Danielle was still on the ground. The instructors helped her sit up, but her face burned with shame. Her vision blurred, not from tears but from exhaustion. The recruits gathered again at the benches, whispering to one another. Danielle sat apart, staring at her trembling hands. She had reached her breaking point. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Danielle stood alone by the training ground. The obstacles loomed before her like silent judges. She felt small in their shadow. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice breaking. She thought about quitting. The idea terrified her, but it also seemed like the only escape. She could go home, explain that she tried, that it just wasn't possible. Her family would be disappointed, but maybe they would understand. But another voice inside her whispered something else. You didn't come this far to walk away. Her fists clenched at her sides. She was caught between 2 paths, surrendering or holding on a little longer. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't facing this choice alone. Commander Harris, the SEAL commander, had been watching her closely. From the shadows near the field, his sharp eyes followed her every movement, every struggle, every fall, and soon he would step forward. Soon he would give the one order that could change everything. The morning began like all the others. The whistle cut through the air, sharp and commanding. The recruits lined up, their uniforms already damp with the dew of dawn. Danielle stood among them, her body aching, her spirit heavy, but her face calm. She didn't want anyone to see the storm inside her. Commander Harris stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, eyes scanning the recruits. He was a man who rarely spoke unless it mattered. With years of Navy SEAL experience carved into his posture, he carried an air of authority that made everyone straighten when he walked past. Many feared him, some respected him, but all listened when he spoke. For days, Harris had been watching Danielle. He had seen her stumble in the runs, collapse in the obstacle courses, and fall behind in every drill. Yet, he had also seen something others overlooked. Each time she fell, she tried again. Each time she failed, she came back the next day, ready to face the same pain. He noticed the fire in her eyes when she whispered to herself before a drill. He noticed the way she clenched her fists, refusing to surrender even when her body begged her to stop. He saw her spirit, the kind of spirit that training couldn't create but could be shaped into greatness. But Danielle didn't see herself that way. To her, each failure was proof that she wasn't enough. The drill began. This time it was a long endurance test, running, crawling, climbing, then lifting weights while instructors shouted at their backs. The course was designed to break down even the strongest. Danielle started with determination. Her arms pumped, her legs carried her forward, and she focused on one step at a time. For the first few minutes, she managed to stay close to the group. But then came the hill run. The steep incline mocked her, each step heavier than the last. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, and one by one, the other recruits passed her. She tried to keep up, but her legs gave way halfway up the hill. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and pressed her palms into the dirt. "Get up!" the instructor shouted. Danielle forced herself to stand, her whole body shaking. She pushed forward, slow and uneven until she reached the top, long after the others had finished. By then, her strength was almost gone. Harris watched silently, his eyes narrowing. She had the heart of a fighter, but she was drowning in her own doubts. He could see it in the way her shoulders slumped, in the way she avoided the eyes of her peers, in the way she carried invisible weight heavier than any gear on her back. The recruits moved on to the lifting station. Large sandbags lay on the ground, each one heavy enough to test even the strongest arms. The task was to lift the bag, carry it across the field, and return without dropping it. Danielle bent down, gripped the rough fabric, and tried to lift. The bag barely moved. She tried again, her muscles straining, sweat dripping from her forehead. Finally, she managed to raise it halfway, but her arms shook violently. She staggered forward, taking a few steps before the weight slipped from her grasp. It hit the ground with a dull thud. The instructor's whistle pierced the air. "Pick it up!" Danielle bent down again, her breath ragged, her arms trembling. She tried once, twice, 3 times, but the bag refused to rise. Around her, the other recruits moved swiftly, completing the task while she remained stuck in place. At last, her arms gave out completely. She dropped to her knees, her face pale, her eyes staring at the ground. She had nothing left. The drill ended. The recruits gathered in formation once more, their faces tired but steady. Danielle stood at the end of the line, her shoulders sagging, mud clinging to her uniform. Her heart pounded with frustration. That evening, after the recruits had returned to the barracks, Harris remained on the field. He paced slowly, his mind deep in thought. He had seen countless trainees over the years, some strong, some weak, some broken. But Danielle was different. She was failing every test, yet she refused to walk away. There was a spark in her, buried beneath fear and exhaustion, and he knew that spark could be ignited. He thought of his own past. He remembered the days when he had been a young recruit, when failure had haunted him too. He remembered the commanders who had pushed him, the orders that had sharpened him into who he became. And he realized Danielle needed the same. The next morning, as the recruits assembled, Harris stepped forward. His presence alone made the group stiffen. He walked down the line, his boots hitting the ground with steady weight, his eyes sharp as steel. When he stopped, it was in front of Danielle. Her heart pounded. She stood straighter, trying not to let fear show. She expected him to call her out for her failures, to tell her she didn't belong here. But Harris only looked at her for a long moment, saying nothing. His gaze was steady, not cruel, not soft, but piercing, as if he could see straight into her doubts. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but powerful. "You have more inside you than you realize." Danielle blinked, surprised. She didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to her like that here. Harris continued, "You're not failing because you're weak. You're failing because you're fighting yourself. That ends now." His words sank deep, heavy and sharp. For the first time, Danielle felt seen, not just as the recruit who always came last, but as someone worth more than her mistakes. Harris straightened, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow you'll get one order from me, and when you follow it, everything will change." With that, he walked away, leaving Danielle standing there with her heart racing and her thoughts tangled. She didn't know what he meant. She didn't know why he had chosen to speak to her. But something inside her stirred. A small spark of hope she thought she had lost. And for the first time in days, she whispered to herself, not in despair, but in determination, "Maybe I can still do this." The street was no longer filled with suspicion. It was filled with silence. The kind of silence that comes when people realize they are standing in the presence of someone greater than they first believed. David stood quietly, his cane steady, in his hand, his figure outlined by the flashing lights of the police car. His calm expression hadn't changed, but everything else around him had. The crowd that had once whispered nervously now stared with admiration. The officers who had treated him with hostility only moments ago now looked uneasy, their authority slipping through their fingers. The taller officer still held the wallet with the badge inside, but now it felt heavy in his hands. He cleared his throat, but his voice faltered. "Mr. Miller," he said, his tone far softer than before, We didn't realize who you were." David's eyes lifted to him, calm but sharp. "And who did you think I was?" he asked softly. The words stung. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes moving from the officers to David, then back again. The taller officer looked down, ashamed to answer. The younger officer, red in the face, tried to recover. "We were just following procedure," he said quickly, though even he didn't sound convinced by his own excuse. "We had to make sure, but a voice from the crowd cut him off. "No, you didn't. You treated him like a criminal before you even knew the truth." A woman stepped forward, her phone still recording. "That man is a hero, and you couldn't even give him basic respect." The crowd nodded, their energy building. The atmosphere had shifted. The people were no longer just watching, they were defending. David raised his hand slightly, and the crowd quieted. His voice was calm, even gentle, though it carried a power that silenced everyone. Respect shouldn't be given because of a medal. Respect should be given because we're all human. I shouldn't need a badge to be treated with dignity. The words sank deep, and even the officers felt the weight of them. The taller one swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the ground. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, his bravado gone. The old man on the porch nodded with approval. "That's the truth right there," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "It's not about what he's done. It's about who he is, a man." And that should have been enough. Applause broke out in the crowd. It started with a few claps, then spread until the entire street was filled with the sound. The officers stood stiff, their faces burning with shame, while David remained still, letting the sound wash over him. A teenage boy pushed through the crowd, holding his phone close to his chest. His voice was shaky but full of admiration. "Sir, my dad served too. He always told me that real heroes never brag about what they did. Looking at you now, I finally understand what he meant." David gave him a small nod, his expression softening. "Your father is right," he said gently. "True honor is quiet. It doesn't need to shout." The boy smiled, his eyes wide, and stepped back into the crowd. The taller officer, still clutching the wallet, finally stepped forward. His voice was unsteady, carrying both regret and guilt. "Mr. Miller, I owe you an apology. We both do." He glanced at his partner, who nodded reluctantly. "We judged you before we knew you. We shouldn't have." David's eyes lingered on him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Apologies matter less than change. What will you do next time you see someone who doesn't look like me, who doesn't carry a badge in their wallet? Will you treat them with respect, or will you repeat this mistake?" The officer had no answer. His mouth opened, then closed. He lowered his head, realizing that the lesson he was receiving was not just for him, but for everyone present. The younger officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He mumbled, "We'll do better." But even he knew the words were not enough. David turned back to the crowd. His voice carried not just to them, but to the cameras recording, to the world beyond that street. "What happened here tonight isn't about me. It's about what too many people go through every day. Some stories never get told. Some voices never get heard. But every one of them matters." The crowd nodded, their faces solemn now, their admiration growing with every word. They weren't just looking at a veteran anymore. They were looking at a man who had the strength to speak truth without anger, to show dignity in the face of humiliation. The old man on the porch smiled faintly. "That's why you're a hero, son," he said. "Not because of the medals, but because of the man you are." David's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the weight he carried seemed to lift. He looked at the faces around him, strangers, neighbors, children, elders, all standing together in the glow of the flashing lights. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a small smile. The taller officer finally handed back the wallet, his hand trembling slightly. "Here, sir," he said quietly. "Thank you for your service and for your patience." David accepted it, slipping it back into his jacket without a word. His silence spoke louder than any thanks could. The atmosphere on the street had completely changed. What began as suspicion had turned into respect. What started with hostility had ended with admiration. The people no longer saw David as just a quiet man with a cane. They saw him as a symbol of dignity, strength, and truth. And though the night was not yet over, one thing was clear. No one there would ever forget what they had witnessed. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they are fought quietly, at home, in the hearts of those willing to stand with patience, dignity, and courage. The crowd slowly quieted, but the feeling in the air remained heavy, like a weight pressing on everyone's chest. David's words still echoed. "Respect shouldn't be given because of a medal. Respect should be given because we're all human." For a moment, no one spoke. The officers stood stiff, unsure how to face him. The taller one kept glancing at his partner, hoping for something to say, but nothing came. The younger one looked down at the ground, his earlier confidence gone. The people, however, could not hold back their emotions. A woman in the front wiped, tears from her eyes. "I've lived here all my life," she said softly, "and I've never seen someone stand so calm under such treatment. You're stronger than most of us could ever be." Her words carried through the silence. Others nodded, their faces filled with respect. A man stepped forward, his phone still recording. "Sir," he said carefully, "I don't know you, but tonight you've taught all of us something we'll never forget." David didn't smile or raise his voice. He simply gave a small nod, his calm presence filling the street more powerfully than shouting ever could. His silence made people listen even harder. The teenager from earlier stepped closer again, his voice nervous but eager. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I told my dad I wanted to join the service one day. He always told me that being a soldier wasn't just about fighting wars. It was about protecting people. Looking at you right now, I understand what he meant." David's eyes softened as he looked at the boy. "Your father is right," he replied. "Serving is not only about carrying a weapon. Sometimes it's about carrying yourself with patience, even when it's hardest. Sometimes it's about standing for what's right without raising your fist. If you can do that, you'll already be serving." The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded quickly, his admiration clear. His friends behind him whispered in awe, realizing they were witnessing something greater than just an argument on the street. The old man on the porch leaned forward on his cane and spoke in a rough but warm voice. "This man here has fought battles none of us can imagine, and tonight he fought another, without firing a single shot. That's the kind of strength this world needs." Applause rose again from the crowd. But this time, it was not loud or wild. It was steady and respectful, the kind of applause one gives at a ceremony, not a spectacle. People clapped slowly, their eyes never leaving David. The officers felt the sting of every clap. It was not meant for them. It was a reminder of their failure. The taller one finally gathered the courage to speak again. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice strained. "We were wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you know we've learned something tonight." David turned his head slightly, his calm eyes locking on the officers. "Learning is not enough if it ends. Here," he said firmly. "What will matter is how you treat the next person you stop. A lesson only has value if you live it." The officer's lips tightened. He gave a small nod, knowing David was right. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his pride broken. For once, he said nothing. Silence was his only answer. Meanwhile, phones continued recording. People knew this moment would spread far beyond this street. Already, some were posting live updates, their captions filled with phrases like, "Local, hero speaks truth, and this man's calm is stronger than anger." Within minutes, the video began to gain attention online. But no one there thought about fame. They were too caught in the presence of something real, something powerful. A middle-aged man from the crowd suddenly spoke up. His voice shook with emotion. "Mr. Miller, my brother served too. He never came back. Seeing you tonight, it feels like I'm hearing his voice again, reminding me of the dignity he carried, no matter what." David placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Then his spirit lives on through you," he said softly. "Carry it with pride." The man wiped his eyes, his shoulders trembling. The crowd remained silent, touched by the kindness in David's words. The lights from the police car still flashed, but their harshness no longer felt threatening. Instead, they seemed to spotlight David, as if the whole street had turned into a stage where truth was being spoken. A small girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mama, he's like a superhero." The mother smiled gently, brushing the girl's hair back. "Yes, but the kind of hero who doesn't need a cape." David overheard and gave the child a small nod, his first real smile of the night. It was brief, but it lit up his face, and the crowd responded with warmth. The taller officer stepped back, his posture no longer commanding but humbled. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again," he said. His words sounded like a promise, though time would tell if he could keep it. David gave no reply. Instead, he turned to the crowd once more. "Remember," he said quietly, "this isn't about me. It's about how we treat each other every day, no matter who we are. If dignity is only given to some, then it isn't dignity at all." The words cut deep, reaching every listener. No one clapped this time. No one cheered. They simply stood in silence, letting the truth settle in their hearts. The old man finally spoke again, his voice carrying the final word. "That's wisdom worth more than medals." David lowered his gaze, his face calm, but inside he felt a quiet strength. He had not planned to speak this night, but sometimes moments find us. And when they do, we either run from them or stand firm. David had chosen to stand, and the impact of his stand would not end here. By the time David stepped back from the crowd, the street had changed. What had started as a tense night filled with suspicion had turned into a quiet celebration of courage, patience, and dignity. The officers had left, humbled and thoughtful. Their authority diminished not by force, but by truth. The neighbors remained, lingering in small clusters, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Phones were still out, cameras recording, voices capturing snippets of his calm wisdom. The story was already beginning to spread beyond the block, beyond the city. David leaned lightly on his cane, scanning the faces around him. He saw admiration, relief, curiosity, and even a kind of hope. The kind of hope that grows quietly after someone shows strength without violence. A young man from the crowd approached him nervously. "Sir," he said, voice shaking, "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for serving our country, but for standing up tonight. You've shown all of us something we'll never forget." David gave a faint nod. "I didn't stand for thanks," he replied gently. "I stood to remind people of something they often forget, that every person deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they carry." A small group of children hovered nearby, eyes wide. One of them whispered to her friend, "He's like a real-life hero." Her friend nodded, smiling. "But he doesn't even brag about it. That's what makes him different." David overheard, and for the first time that night, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It wasn't pride. It was recognition. Recognition that the lesson he carried in his heart had been heard. The old man on the porch cleared his throat. "You taught them more than words ever could," he said softly. "They'll remember this night for years." David's eyes met his. "I hope they remember it not for me, but for what it represents. Dignity, patience, the courage to be calm in the face of misunderstanding." The crowd began to disperse slowly, the murmurs filled with admiration. Some people stopped to shake David's hand, others waved, and a few simply watched him quietly, absorbing the gravity of what had happened. Back on the street, the sound of vehicles passing by was normal again, the lights of homes flickering in familiar patterns. But the energy of the night remained, lingering in a subtle way, like a memory that refused to fade. Later, the video clips captured by the crowd began circulating online. Within hours, people across the city and even the country were watching the calm, unflinching figure of David Miller. Social media posts praised him for his humility, his courage, and his wisdom. Comments poured in. "True heroism is patience. This man teaches dignity to the world. We need more people like him." David watched it all quietly in his small living room, the television casting soft light across his calm face. He didn't smile at the attention. He didn't seek it. He simply nodded slightly to himself, knowing that if the story reached even one person who treated others with more respect because of it, then the night had mattered. A local news anchor summarized the story on the evening broadcast. A black veteran, stopped unjustly by police, faced the situation with patience and dignity. His calm words and quiet courage have inspired a community and reminded us all that respect is earned not by force, but by the way we treat one another. David listened, leaning back in his chair. The badge that had caused such tension sat on the table beside him. It was a reminder, not of glory, but of the responsibility that came with every action. The responsibility to act with integrity, no matter how small the situation seemed. The next morning, neighbors who had witnessed the event came by to greet him. Some brought flowers, others offered baked goods, and a few simply stopped to say a heartfelt thank you. David accepted it all with quiet nods, his demeanor unchanged but his heart lighter. Even the officers returned the following day, this time without flashing lights or harsh voices. They approached him cautiously. The taller one cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, we wanted to apologize properly. What happened last night, we let assumptions guide us and we were wrong." David looked at him for a long moment. "I accept that," he said simply. "But remember, it's not about apologies. It's about change. Treat the next person better. That's the most important thing." The officers nodded, humbled, and turned to leave. David watched them go, knowing that the lesson of that night had reached someone who needed it most. Over the next few weeks, the story continued to spread. Local schools invited David to speak about patience and dignity. Community. Groups asked him to share his experience in handling conflict with calmness. He spoke to them not as a celebrity, not as a soldier, but as a man who had learned that respect, patience, and courage mattered more than medals or recognition. David continued his quiet life, walking his familiar streets, visiting friends, and helping neighbors when he could. But the night on that street remained a turning point, a moment when the world, small as it may have seemed, saw the power of calm, patient strength. Even months later, when people talked about the viral video, they didn't speak of David's military service first. They spoke of his patience, his dignity, and the way a single calm man had transformed a tense night into a lesson for everyone. David never sought fame. He never wanted recognition. But the lesson he lived had become a legacy, one that spread quietly yet powerfully through the hearts of those who had witnessed it, and through countless others who would hear the story in the days and years to come. And so the quiet man with the cane, the black veteran once harassed on a simple street at night, became more than a story. He became a symbol, a reminder that true courage is not always loud, that true strength is not always seen, and that dignity, patience, and humanity are the greatest medals anyone can ever earn.